Hello everybody and welcome to the Feel Good Club podcast. I'm Emma, your host, and today I'm going to be talking about something that is incredibly close to my heart, personally and professionally, and it's about neurodivergence and how maybe there isn't one correct way of us being human, and how we can all contribute to living our lives as individuals, but in much more of a compassionate society. So if you are neurodivergent, neurospicy, newly diagnosed, self-diagnosed, or not neurodivergent, but maybe touched by someone in your life that is, then this episode is for you. It's for everyone. Sit back, enjoy, and let me know if this has supported you in some way. Hello everybody, thank you so much for being here today, for returning. If this is your other multiple times of listening in, or maybe it's your first time, welcome. Today I am talking about neurodivergence, and specifically the topic on different, not deficient, and how neurodivergency, particularly for me and my personal life, has grown a greater sense of compassion towards myself, and as a byproduct of that, compassion towards others. So whether you are a late diagnosed adult like me, or a parent, a teacher, or anyone really that's interested in psychology, self-compassion, identity, then hopefully this episode today is for you. And I think really it's a discussion that is for everyone. I don't want it to feel like it's only for people that have a neurodivergence, but certainly it is to raise further awareness, advocacy, and to allow people from within this community, neurodivergent community, to feel noticed, to feel recognised and empowered ultimately. So as I mentioned, this is a very close to my heart topic. I do a lot of advocacy work around neurodivergence, and I have my own personal lived experience through my own life, but also the life of people within my family. And the purpose today is really to allow those who are neurodivergent or identify with neurodivergence to have really just a place to feel understood, to feel recognised. And I would love to hear from you. If today you feel this podcast, this episode has supported you in just feeling understood in any way, I'd love to hear from you. And I'd really love to hear from people that have been in contact with people that are neurodivergent and maybe haven't understood it and have later been able to reflect. So this really is a podcast for everybody today, but I'm really interested to hear from you and hopefully how this is connected with you today. With this new academic year fast approaching, we've already kind of got 3/4 of the way through our summer. We often find in this time that anxiety across homes, across the country, across the world can begin to build, particularly for individuals and families who are neurodivergent. And I want to send a very clear message out today that as we are approaching the academic new year, you are exactly who you are meant to be. Even if that means your previous academic years or your experience of academic years have tried to put you in a box and to try to label you as not being part of the norm or of the expectations. I want you to hear this message really clearly. If you're a young person and maybe don't listen to this podcast, then please, parents or someone else as an adult that is connected, please pass on this message. You are exactly who you are meant to be. Even if others don't get it, even if others don't understand it, please do not change who you are inherently, because you are whole. And I wish this was a message that was passed on at the very early years to many, many people, because neurodivergence, we are growing in its awareness now, which is wonderful. It obviously has a huge history, and I'm going to be specifically talking today about my own personal experience, mainly with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And even saying the word disorder to me doesn't sit quite comfortably. So ADHD is normally the phrase that I would use, but I don't view it as a disorder, just mainly because I don't view myself as broken, and I certainly don't look at the people that have been diagnosed as broken either. I view every person, neurodivergent or not, from a place of wholeness. And so when we get put into labels or within the society where maybe neurotypical expectations are placed upon us, or the constraints of that, we can be very much viewed from a place of not the norm, or maybe different, or maybe broken, or that we need help or support or need treating. And I think it's very easy for young people in particular, but also adults who maybe haven't been given this empowered message. It's very, very easy to view yourself when you look in the mirror, or maybe don't, to view yourself from a place that needs fixing. There's a brokenness. And I want to send a message to everybody today that you are whole, exactly as you are. And learn to love yourself. Learn all of those nuances, those intricacies, those bits that are a bit different or look different. Know that you're whole and exactly as you're meant to be. There's an analogy that is often attributed to Albert Einstein. And it doesn't matter whether this phrase that I'm going to say was actually his, but the meaning of it has stayed with me, and it's something that I often pass on to others. And this phrase is, everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. I love that, because it very quickly gives us the visualization of the fish being whole in its natural surroundings, doing what it does, breathing underwater, swimming underwater, and living just as it's meant to. But in society, we often want to take that fish out and make it climb the tree like a monkey. And of course, it's not going to be able to do that. So we've completely lost where its strengths lie. It's the environment that's made the fish feel like it's not capable. So maybe that for you can translate into how you felt in your life. Have you ever spent your life being told or believing you're just a little bit too much? You're a bit too much for me. Or maybe, that's not enough. You're not doing that as well as all of the others. Or maybe you've heard the question, what's wrong with you? You know, all of these different words that can become a cycle in the mind of low self-worth, low self-esteem. And that analogy of the fish and the tree, it very quickly allows us to remember, well, of course people are going to ask those questions of us if they're viewing us from a different place, from their place. But we know where our strengths lie. So when someone says you're a bit too much, they're not telling you that you're too much. They're telling you that we're too much for them. And I think that's a really important distinction, that it needs to be made. That there is nothing wrong with us as the individual. It's just that we don't meet the standards, the quality, or the expectation of what that person in front of us is asking of us. And maybe they don't meet ours. So for neurodivergency and for that labeling or that quote from Albert Einstein, it just allows us to remind ourselves that there is nothing wrong, other than the world may have just asked something from us that we're not meant for. But luckily for me, I was brought up with two people who always reflected back to me my potential and my capabilities. So from a really young age, my energy, my passion, my creativity was very much put on stage from the age of 7, actually. And it was my grandparents that would take me all around the country to be performing in different venues, different locations across the UK. So I was built up from a really young age and always reminded that whatever I put my mind to, I was capable of. So when it came to me being in circumstances or situations like education where I maybe didn't fit or conform, I had something to fall back on that I knew I was really good at, or I was capable of, or I had something that reminded me of my purpose and my self-worth. So I kind of grew up with this feeling that, I could do anything really with support and whatever I set my mind to. And I had enough self-worth to advocate for myself in times of need. However, I know that that isn't the story for many people, and I've met many people who have grown up in a world where they've been told they're not enough, they're not good enough, but also haven't had maybe the support or the understanding of where their strengths lie. And for so many people who haven't had the startings that I was so very lucky to have, that can manifest in early years, but also in later life as feeling very much that they are coming from a broken place, or they're not worth anything, or they have nothing to stand up for themselves for. And that is why it's so really very, very important that in life we all have at least just one person, just one trusted person that we can go to in times of need that can help to build us back up again. So whether that is you as a trusted adult or a person for a young person, never underestimate the significance, the impact that you could have on a person, whether they have neurodivergency or not. Now, my neurodivergence has taken me on a wild ride through navigating school, not always fitting in, but very much being the centre of attention, most times because I made it so that I was in control of how I was being perceived, to maybe ending up in quite a bit of trouble in school. I had a couple of exclusions. Isolation room was always on the card, particularly for maths, and many other risk-taking behaviours that I'm not going to mention too much here today, but certainly wouldn't be anything of the stretch of my imagination of what I would do in my current state of life. But I want to mention that, I too have gone on a wild, wild ride with how my image, how my presentation would have maybe been perceived to others, whether that be to simply oversharing. I mean, today could be an absolute example of my ADHD, that I'm completely oversharing my experience, but I'm doing it for a just cause today. Or maybe overcaring to losing many, many friendships. And there might be people listening today that have known me from the past or from my younger years and have gone, wow, she's totally different now. Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I was just masking back then. Or you might be a friend that we once were very close, but now we're not so much anymore. And part of having ADHD often is that we can lose relationships very easily, because for me in particular, it's a real struggle to conform with the norm. I don't like being in huge big groups, but I don't mind standing up in front of a big crowd of people. So there's always a big paradox to how I function, and maybe what people would see or perceive as being this person that doesn't mind being the center of attention actually internally really can't bear being the center of attention. It takes a lot of my energy to do that. So relationships end up falling often by the wayside because they just can't be maintained at the level or at the masking that somebody with neurodivergence, specifically ADHD for me, has to maintain. And when I'm talking today about neurodivergence, of course, there are many, many different divergencies. I can only speak from my experience today on ADHD. And of course, the presentation, the signs and symptoms of that are also very different. And I will get into that a little bit later on. But if you, like me, feel that you have had a wild ride that maybe has started off by you not fitting in, not feeling like you are part of anything, but then at the same time, you're able to function at a very high level, maybe entrepreneurial, running multiple successful businesses at once that people would never have believed that you would have been capable to do at school, or functioning at a really high stress level and living to tell the tale, are all thanks really to neurodivergence for me. And I'm really actually super grateful that I have this as a quality of mine, because what it gives me in life are chapters and seasons and moments to remember, to reflect back on, not with shame or regret anymore, but actually with deep compassion, knowing better now of why and how those things evolved in the way that they did. And I'm hoping after today that that's exactly how you or somebody that you know with ADHD may be able to start to reflect upon themselves with a little bit more understanding and a little bit more compassion. And if you have somebody in your family that maybe is currently being diagnosed or having investigations into, I also can relate to that. Without going into too much personal details, in 2016, I really only understood myself a little bit more through understanding and seeing how my son was perceived within the world, specifically within the education system. And I could see before my very eyes the damage that can be done through society, through norming, to a person who is constantly made to feel that they're not good enough or they're not the same as everyone else, that their special characteristics are not accepted within a normal characteristic. And so that really was where my education and my advocacy began. I've been a little bit late myself to the diagnosis of ADHD, both combined, not because really that I needed to have the diagnosis. I already knew back in 2016 when we were having to look and research a little bit more for my son. I already knew at that point, okay, the experience is very similar to mine, and I started to understand different moments in my earlier life as to why they would happen in the way that they would. But my reason for diagnosis only a couple of months ago was simply because my university insisted on it. They insisted that if I was to receive any support or disability support, not that I felt that I needed support, but I just needed understanding, that I would need to have an official medical diagnosis. That didn't sit too well for me. I very much believe that we should view people from a holistic place, and I don't think it requires a lot for people or for institutions or education establishments to be able to offer a person an individual level of support. And I think all that is required is understanding and compassion. However, I did it. I got the diagnosis. It told me everything that I already knew. And it allowed me to be able to tell the university, okay, I may need support in this, and this area. And they said, okay, yeah, that's fine. So today I want to explore what neurodivergence really has taught me about compassion, about the presentations maybe of how they show up, and what we can all do to contribute to building each other up a little bit more. And not just neurodivergent people, but all beings, in fact. And why this continuation of being human uniquely should absolutely be savoured. So the beginning question really is how did we get here today with neurodivergence? How has it begun to be recognised? And we can hear it being talked about so much more now, thankfully, particularly ADHD and autism. But even in the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, it was hardly discussed. It certainly wasn't known or discussed when I was back at high school or primary school, even though my teachers, if you spoke to them now, and I have spoken to a couple of them over the last few years, have said, wow, Emma, yeah, if we knew back then when you put your feet through the plasterboard wall because you couldn't sit on your seat long enough anymore, then we would have absolutely have said, yeah, you have inattentiveness or hyperactivity. Or maybe when you threw the snooker ball across the room and didn't even consider for a moment that it might land into someone's rib, we absolutely would have said you were impulsive. And I'm really sorry to that person. If they are listening, they know who they are. I'm forever sorry that the snooker ball went in your rib. And I don't mean to laugh, but it's one of those chapters that, you look back on and you think, wow, yeah, I can see how that was a presentation of ADHD. But right now, what we have is this moment within society where it's becoming more and more recognised, it's becoming more and more accepted, but it's also still stigmatised, that we've got people or children displaying what would once have been recognised as the aspects of ADHD as being the naughty syndrome or just poor parenting or poor nutrition. I still hear people saying these things as judgments often, or, oh, it's just another person that's been diagnosed. And I find that so incredibly disappointing that we've got to a place where there's better education and better support than there was in the past. And we're finding ways within society to dumb that down or criticise it or judge it rather than becoming more understanding and compassionate. Back in the early 1900s, the first description of ADHD came from a British paediatrician, George Still. And he described children with what he would have suggested is now known as ADHD. Get ready for this. As a defect of moral control, which, if that was a description somebody would have given me back in 1998 or earlier, what would that have done to me? That could have totally damaged my self-worth. But thankfully, now is viewed through a lens that is much more holistic, and it views and considers the environment, the circumstance, the sleep, the nutrition of a person so that we can understand cause and effect for how maybe somebody with ADHD is responding to their environment. So without criticising George Still, I'm sure he only had the information that he had at the time. It's evolved since then. Even in 1932, it moved to hyperkinetic disease of infancy. So it suggested even in 1932 that the symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattentiveness were only really for infants, for children. They didn't see it in adults. And what later transpired from that is identifying ADHD as only an infant concern was that in 1937, medication was offered to help improve what was known as poor school performance or poor behaviours from certain children. And that really gets me to thinking, and I've done a little bit of deeper research on this, that all of that time in those earlier 1900s, it was viewed as hyperactivity or impulsivity or inattentiveness. And in 1937, it was decided we're actually going to create a medication for this to improve not the child's perspectives, but to improve their ability to perform in school. And it isn't a coincidence that only at that time did it happen, because education became compulsory. Leading after the Great Depression, where jobs dried up, which would have been usually the route for people that are a little bit more physical, a little bit more hands-on. Maybe their skill set is being practical and being creative, where they would find their jobs in those environments, or maybe working on their family farm or building up their own business. They wouldn't have been typically the people that would have sat behind a desk and been in academia for 7+ hours sitting still and being lectured to. It was only at the point where education became absolutely compulsory that we decided the only way that we can teach is by sitting people down behind a desk still for 7+ hours. So in order to comply with that, we need to medicate it. And I really think that is a key moment to where this view of brokenness came from, where this view that we needed to make children in education comply to a neurotypical circumstance. It later moved on. In the 1960s and 80s, it was starting to be renamed as ADD or combined presentations. In 1987, they started to see that hyperactivity and inattentiveness could be comorbid. They could run hand in hand. And it's only really in the later 2000s where clinical recognition for ADHD has recognized that this isn't a condition that is only in childhood or in infancy. This is a lifelong condition that can be in adulthood and very much present in adulthood, because it isn't just a disease, or as George Still described it, a defect of moral control. It is absolutely a complex genetic and neurodevelopmental condition that affects executive functioning across the lifespan. And it isn't something that should be, oh, they'll grow out of it, you know? It might be that someone learns to mask or to cope in a neurotypical environment, but this neurodevelopmental condition is very much lifelong. And so I would very much like that recent reframe of the 2000s to continue to be explored based on the qualities of a person being whole throughout their whole of their life rather than broken, and to really be met with a sense of compassion, that it isn't something that we choose to be or to do. It is just the way that we are, which sadly isn't the way that people have always been treated. And it goes without saying that when a society continues to press down a person or to ridicule or to treat them as if they are broken, then the effects of that are going to be devastating. And we see this time and time again now. There is so much research out there, particularly in our prison populations, of how the rates of ADHD within our prison populations are increasing. And there was a study in 2024, which I will link into the bio of the episode, by Faisal et al., who showed that there was substantially higher rates than the general population of people being in prison with ADHD, estimated to be around about 25%. And this really makes me question, as an excuse, of course, for criminality, but as an understanding, how many of those inmates spent their childhood being told that they were difficult, they were disruptive, impulsive, lazy, stupid, or bad, without anyone really ever asking or understanding why they were struggling. And there is a question often asked within psychotherapy, which is, don't ask what is wrong with you. Ask what happened to you. And there have been many, many great therapists and psychologists that have used that phrase, because it is so important that we view a person from their wholeness, and that life just somehow chipped away at them and created these scars and these cracks that led to a brokenness. And I just wish sometimes that we maybe would look at that within our population, particularly the prison population, and ask ourselves as a society, were we partly responsible for that, for how that person was nurtured within the environment they were in, or maybe how they were misunderstood? And of course, I don't want to make this about, I want to be really, really clear, in fact, that I don't want to make out that ADHD equals criminality. I think there's enough, kind of lost words and lost translations around what neurodivergence means and how that can be stigmatized and how it can actually be criminalized as well. But it's really a question of how, if neurodivergency goes unmet with the needs, and there's, the exclusions from education systems and failures to support a person, or maybe that leads to trauma or bullying, or maybe even poverty, or maybe even substance misuse because they're trying to numb something. There's this social disadvantage. Maybe there could be a better conversation around, rather than just seeing the neurodivergence as a reason that someone has become a criminal, but asking, could that have been nurtured better to steer and support that person away from that social disadvantage? And I think this really is where the makeup of social responsibility comes into supporting not just neurodivergency, but all people, viewing everybody as a whole person and asking the question, what happened, rather than why are you doing what you're doing, There are ways that we can support ADHD, but it requires us to be really familiar with the presentations, the domains really of ADHD, for us to be able to recognize it, maybe early on in an education setting, maybe even earlier in the toddler years, of being able to identify. One is the attention or the executive functioning, and two is the hyperactivity, the impulsivity. And it's not always the same in males and females, boys or girls. Particularly for females, for girls, it's not a question of what is being presented in front of you is actually the presentation of the condition. Most of the times with females, they will learn to mask, and they will mask really, really well. I did it for a really long time. It's the outside picture. It doesn't always match what the inside experience is. So the two areas that you can view are the inattentiveness and the hyperactivity. And this is for anybody that is looking at themselves as an ADHD possibility. This is for teachers, coaches, schools, education establishments that maybe want to look a little bit further into how you can support your students. This is workplaces, people that are working with people that have maybe got different qualities, or maybe even just your family or your friends, So the first, inattentiveness, could possibly look like daydreaming. Always looking like they're looking out of a window, or maybe looking through you when you're talking to them. Maybe losing items. I know losing school jumpers, losing car keys, putting car keys in a bin, losing mobile phones has always been a thing in our household. And it requires very rigid structures of where things all now need to be in order to not lose things. It might be missing details. I know for me, sending an email or sending a text message, I can guarantee I'll have had several spelling mistakes. Not because I can't spell, but just because there is a rush for me to get it done. And I would rather check it after I've sent it and then be filled with a whole host of dread afterwards that I didn't take my time. So it's the missing of the details, the impulsivity to just get it done and finished. That could, for women, look like overcompensating, particularly when a female is having to maintain focus for a long time. They may try so hard to keep focus, to keep maintaining relationships and to process information, that they may achieve it, they may achieve the view of attentiveness, but that could look like mood disorders or anxiety later on down the line, or maybe even immediately. So sometimes for females, the overcompensating, the masking can show up in other ways too. It might also look like somebody's easily bored or distracted, or maybe you just think they're really rude and they're not paying you much attention when you're talking. That could just possibly be that it's the only way that they can remain stimulated is to keep their gaze wandering around, or they've become distracted by the noise that's going on outside. They'll still probably hear what you're saying, but they've got multiple things taking their attention. It's a tendency to start multiple projects at once. I know only too well about this. Having multiple lists of things to do and overwhelming yourself with how much needs to be done, and maybe not really ever being able to start or get them finished. And that then comes with a mental focus avoidance. So if you know that you've got something that is quite heavy or a big cognitive load, then you're likely going to avoid that. And inattentiveness can also show up with being highly sensitive or a rejection to deal with this internal hypersensitivity. The pros of that, though, are we can become incredibly hyper-focused. Really deep learners on things that we are very intrinsically motivated by, and productivity can go off the chart. The second domain could be hyperactivity, which looks like traditionally like we don't like waiting in a line. We don't like taking turns. We almost definitely will have to bite our tongue and shut our teeth in order to stop interrupting others when you get later on down the line and realise that there's a social cue there not to interrupt because it looks like you're being rude. But if you're in school, you're not aware of that just yet. You will shout out the answer even if a question wasn't asked. It could also look like difficulty in engaging with quiet or relaxing activities. Now, this actually for me was the opposite. When I first came to yoga, The first class that I actually did was a yin yoga class, which for many of you, if you've practiced yin, will know that it's a passive practice of around about 3 minutes to 5 minutes, maybe even sometimes longer, to hold just one posture, one asana. And you are just left in this stillness, normally guided by a teacher of sensations, but you're left on your own in this silence to just sit with yourself, in your body, in your thoughts. I found that really comforting, and I was able to find a sense of relaxation in that. But I know for many people that this can almost be torment, really, really incredibly difficult. It may also look like unable to sit still, quite restless, or having racing thoughts, this inner restlessness. It can also look like hyperactivity, feeling burnt out, exhausted all the time, because there are so many things going on in the mind, so many things going on in the body. But the pros on all of that, because I do want to balance it out, because that could seem like, who would want that? Who would want ADHD? Well, actually, I do, because the pros are that it's out of the box creativity. I am absolutely 100% certain I couldn't have done the things that I've done in my life so far, particularly around creativity, if I didn't have ADHD. It is this propelling of problem solving and innovation that I get from this quality, from this condition. I have this high drive, this high energy, which I see and witness and recognize in so many other ADHD people. This ability to have a sharp intuition, that they can just read a room. They can see the social cues and the patterns that others that are neurotypical may miss. They have this ability to crisis management. So great in leadership, great in management positions, because they remain remarkably calm and clear under high stress and pressure. I always wondered why emergency situations would just fall in front of me and I would be able to respond to them in a really calm, rational manner whilst everyone else was running around like headless chickens. And I realized much, much later down the line, it's because I could cope with it. I didn't shy away from it. Maybe other people would just kind of turn the back and walk away from it. I didn't, and I can't. I sit in it and try to provide some level of crisis management in those situations. People with ADHD I have found to be incredibly resilient, most of the times because of the hard knocks that life has offered, but that has created this strong bounce back mentality and adaptability. And also this ability, this willingness to take risks. ADHD can show up as being incredibly courageous, really entrepreneurial. So I think this is most of the times why working for yourself, if you have ADHD, has always panned out to be the best decisions that you can make, because you have this autonomy, this ability to just let your gut almost lead the way. Dr. Yes, I think Richard Branson is known as, and I think possibly also has been credited as having a neurodivergence too. I don't want to speak out of turn with that, but Dr. Yes says, say yes and think later. If your gut leads you to it, it's probably going to be the right choice. And I think that's something that ADHD also offers. So there are many, many benefits, many pros, as well as being able to navigate the workarounds of some of the difficulties. So it is known, ADHD, as being this thin-skinned perspective. And it doesn't sound too nice to put it in that way. You know, people say, oh, they're very thick-skinned. That person means they're tough. So I suppose the opposite of that would be being thin-skinned and maybe a little bit weaker. I view it differently, and it comes from Gabor Maté's book, Scattered Minds. And if you haven't read that, I would highly encourage you digging that book out and reading it, particularly for anyone that is looking at a diagnosis, or maybe you have self-identified as having ADHD. It's a really, really nurturing book, and Gabor within it also confirms his diagnosis of ADHD. And he has many different perspectives, reasons why ADHD is attributed to a person. I agree with some things. I don't agree with all of the things, but that's what makes it a great book. But one of the things I did find really very interesting was that people with ADHD are thin-skinned, as he puts it. And it's not a negative. It's this highly porous, emotional and physiological makeup that a person with ADHD has as a quality that requires the person that they are in front of to have just compassion and understanding rather than behavioural management. And I notice this thin-skinned effect very much on myself. I get goosebumps all the time, which is also known as frisson in the medical world. And I was only speaking to a friend about this not so long ago. And it's these goosebumps that appear all over the body whenever I have been met with a song or a piece of poetry or something that has invoked this deep emotional, this visceral reaction. And it can come within seconds and linger for minutes on end, or it can go really quickly. And it is a legitimate, the goosebumps effect, you know, when you say, oh, I've just got goosebumps. It's known as frisson, and it's a legitimate psychophysiological response that involves our autonomic nervous system. And it's where the body is kind of becoming this conduit before the conscious mind can put language towards the emotion. And it is said that people with ADHD, this thin-skinned nature, have this openness, this thin-skinnedness that makes us feel, and not just feel a little bit, but to feel so deeply that we know we're alive. And I love that. I love having that. I love being able to feel that level of emotion, this embodied response to emotion. And Gabor also discusses as well, although I haven't been able to find much research on this, but I do very much connect with this personally, is that at one time or another in the past, ADHD was apparently a symptom of allergies. So this histamine response to the environment would maybe show up as inattentiveness or hyperactivity or coming out in goosebumps maybe. For me, I can have an allergic reaction. Whether you believe this or not, it's true. I can have an allergic reaction where my eyes will swell, my face will swell, I won't be able to breathe properly, almost as if I'm going into some sort of anaphylaxis if I'm in an environment that feels very toxic, very negative. And this has happened to me in multiple different situations. And it's almost as if my body and my emotions are so interconnected around the energy that I feel within my skin that it repels the environment away from me. And I also do suffer as well from allergies. So I do believe, even though the research isn't extensive right now, I do believe that there is a connection there too with this histamine response and allergies and ADHD being linked to this level of feeling a thinner skin. We feel that little bit more. And as I was speaking about this theory to one of my friends, I was met with a beautiful phrase that he said, which really helped to empower not just me, but hopefully him as well. And he said, you know, I would rather be like us, kid, and feel. And I think, you know, that's a really important way to look at ourselves again with compassion, that it's an all or nothing approach with people with ADHD, but at least we feel, at least we know we're alive. And I think it's a rebellion, really, that phrase that he said. It's a rebellion against fitting into this box, to this, normal box. And it's not in any way, for me to romanticize about neurodivergence. I do understand and I recognize the human experience of difficulties that can come with it. But for me, it's about treating these parts of ourselves as not being an inconvenience, and recognizing that on the other hand, we also have creativity. We have this sensitivity, spontaneity. We have this intensity, curiosity, all of the incities, and this divergent thinking, and this feeling that ultimately shows our humanness. And I think that is so necessary right now, particularly in our AI generation, to remind ourselves of what is it that makes us human. And ultimately it's to feel, and it's to be different, and it's to be unique, and it's to love the individualness of each of us that makes a society whole. So I'm not pretending that it's easy. This isn't, again, to put plasters over things and to pretend that the difficulties aren't there. It's not. But today, really, this conversation is just about acceptance of self, learn to love ourselves and to be compassionate for ourselves, our younger selves, our middle selves, our older selves, so that we can refuse, really, to turn the difficulties into shame. And that leads me really towards the final part of this, which is what can we all do to live with understanding, acceptance and compassion? And there are a few different areas really that I would like to speak to. The first is within society. Always question, why are the minority expected to adapt to the majority? Could the view be flipped? And I've seen an image, a visual of this when I was studying a few years ago for my psychology degree. And it was an image of a wheelchair ramp next to stairs. And the person that was using a wheelchair had been blocked from being able to get to the ramp. And it was just the stairs that was left available. And of course, the people that were able to walk were stepping up. And not a single person thought, well, actually, if we blocked off the stairs, then we would all be able to walk up the ramp. And I think for me, it's sometimes getting out of the norm, getting out of our own selfishness at times. If we can change and it doesn't impact us, then why wouldn't we change? Why wouldn't we offer the person that needs it to be the way that they need it to be, offer that as the option rather than forcing the person who can't meet our societal norm to meet it? It's that same analogy again of the fish and climbing up the tree. So as a society, just always question, can I adapt as the majority to support the minority when it comes to neurodivergence or any disability? The second would be to schools. So schools learn and train about neurodivergence. I have met so many wonderful, wonderful teachers and education professionals that have dedicated the majority of their working life to advocate for children of special educational needs and children with neurodivergence. But there are still a number of professionals that I think on their own training, on their own qualified teacher status, don't go so in depth around neurodivergence. And it would be really for me to say to schools to invest in companies that can come in and can train and can support from a place of lived experience, who are also education professionals of how you can support better your environments for children with neurodivergence. And that would still support the majority of your classroom too. So looking at your environment and just ask, how could we change the environment so more children can flourish? And watch your words. Please watch your words. Know that your words will last a lifetime. Parents, I connect with you so deeply from, again, a lived experience, and I give these offerings not as judgment or as criticism or to teach grandma to suck eggs, but just from my own lessons learnt. Keep the bowling lanes on. This comes from my husband. Keep the bowling lanes on down that bowling alley until they're ready to fly. So what I mean by that is keep guiding your children where the boundaries are, but allow them to hit those lanes, allow them to bounce off those boundary walls every now and again so that they do understand. Create enough safety and structure and support that they can continue to develop without requiring themselves to become someone else, and let them lead the way. Let it so often be child-led, because they will lead you to where their interests are. They will lead you to who they are. They will lead you to where they want to go. And when you are enforcing your rules and your standards, just allow yourself the time to question, is this rule or value mine, or have I inherited this without knowing the reason why? And there is a beautiful teaching that connects with that in the Bhagavad Gita about attachment to outcomes. Krishna says within the Bhagavad Gita, you're not entitled to the fruits of your actions. And I think this links to parenting of someone with neurodivergence and with not. It's, can we as parents, can we keep those bowling lanes up without becoming attached to the person in the center of who they're going to become, or how many times they're going to bounce off those walls, or whether they're just going to go and strike it lucky down the center? Can we just be there to hold rather than controlling what their outcome is? And I know that's the hardest lesson of them all, but as long as we can provide structure, safety, and support, they will find their way. And my fourth approach and request would be, don't medicalize it. The medical world is there for a reason, and in the future, I'm going into it. I'm studying clinical psychology. So I understand the importance of the medical world. However, there is a danger with neurodivergence, particularly ADHD, of swinging from one extreme to the other. Where we could maybe say, there's nothing wrong, just try harder, And then we can swing it the other way and go, you have a disorder and now you need to treat all of it. There's these two different parallels that can come up, and neither help the person to view themselves from a place of wholeness or with compassion. So my request here would be to don't speak or treat or support a person from a place of making them feel that they are broken or not doing enough. Help them by listening and understanding and supporting them. My top tips for schools would be, multiple ways to demonstrate. Be creative with your delivery. Allow movement breaks, sensory aware rooms, clear scaffolding and instructions. Don't offer more than one at a time. Be structured and give strength-based education. Empower. Even if you could bring someone to be a leader within a group that is neurodivergent, you will empower them. Don't rely upon punishment and shame. It doesn't work. And look into music. White noise music is really supportive, and there has been research done on that. In work, for professionals or for people starting to look at accepting work experience people, allow yourself to be flexible with working patterns. You're going to get so much more from a neurodivergent person if you can give them some flexibility. Quiet spaces allow people to decompress after a busy meeting, and also Plan fewer unnecessary meetings. Question, does that meeting need to be there? Let them have autonomy. They will flourish if they feel that they have self-responsibility and agency. And view outcomes rather than the productivity. And for families, I would just recommend from my own life lessons, meet with curiosity over judgment every single time and separate behaviours from identity. Become an advocate and really educate yourself so that your young people as well can feel educated and to feel empowered about the qualities they have. And that goes the same for adults too. If you're new or you're becoming diagnosed, educate yourself on yourself. Learn and study about yourself so that you know who you are when people try to pretend that they know you better. And my final reflection today is that I am really, really blessed that I have been able to receive a diagnosis. I know that that's not easy for many people now on the waiting list, and I know there are ways around that. So if you are interested or you're looking or you're on a huge big waiting list, I can make some recommendations that the NHS have put forwards now. You're more than welcome to message me, and I'm more than happy to respond about the different process that I went through. But the gratitude really doesn't come from the label, the diagnosis alone. It comes from this understanding of myself and how I can now remember myself. How I can look back in those moments where maybe I didn't conform or meet the expectations, that in fact I wasn't failing. I was just trying to be like everyone else. And that was probably the biggest lesson of all, that you can't be someone else. You can only ever be yourself. And it's not just made me more compassionate to myself the more that I learn and understand and hear experiences of neurodivergence. It's now also allowed me to be much more compassionate towards others, because I now realize that when someone responds to me, or when someone meets me in a certain way, or when someone has done something that maybe at one time or another I could have taken great offense to, I now meet everybody as potentially just having their own intricacies. And in the words of my teacher, I view it from a place of people don't know what they don't know, Everyone is just responding from their own history, their own nervous system, their own conditioning, their own fears, their own unmet needs, and their own limited perspective. So it allows me to have this sense of compassion, not just for someone who's neurodivergent, but for all beings everywhere. And compassion in being able to say that difference isn't difficult, but refusing to make the difficulty a deficiency is the place that I come from now. So if you want to preserve what is sacred about being human, particularly in this AI era, then please keep trying. We all need to keep getting better at recognizing the things that make us human. That sensitivity, our imagination, our imperfections, absolutely, 100%. Let's keep them coming. The embodied experience and the difference that makes us all whole. And that is it for today. A little bit longer than usual, but it required the talk. Thank you so much for being here. I hope the podcast has supported you in some way. Please send it or share it to whoever you think it might help. And for now, peace out, over and out.